Change back. War and poverty.
So I invite one person from each table to hold up the plate. I invite all of us to stand as we're going to pray together the words that Jesus taught us. But hold up a plate, and we remember especially those who go without as we unite ourselves with Jesus, the Prince of Peace. We pray, Our Father and Mother, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come,
thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, power, and glory, now and forever. Amen.
Let's pray that closing prayer in your worship aids together. You can put the plates back down if you'd like. We pray, Lord God, as we honor today
the massive forces that threaten families, the nation and world, activate the forces of goodness, of justice, of wisdom, of love, and of peace that you alone can give. Give us your spirit, for only in loving imitation of you can we discover and know the healing springs of life that brings new birth into our world. We pray this in your name, God the Creator, Redeemer and Sanctifier, now and forever.
And please join in the closing song on the back of your worship aids.
Peace before us, peace behind us, peace under our feet. Peace within us, peace over us, and all around us be peace. All before us, all behind us, love under our feet. Love within us, love over us, let all around us be love. Life before us, life behind us, life under our feet. Life within us, life over us, let all around us be love. Christ before us, Christ behind us, Christ under our feet. Christ within us, Christ over us, let all around us be Christ. Peace before us, peace behind us, peace under our feet. Peace within us, peace over us, let all around us be peace.
Amen.
Amen.
We have about 6 people who'd like to see that. So I get 3 more people here.
Just when you put a mix up.
Carry over here.
Yeah.
Am I please?
One here.
We can just kind of fill in people.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Sister Merle, and I have the joy of introducing our keynote speaker. But before doing that, I want to call your attention to the 2 actions we wish to invite you to take today. The materials are in your packet. The first is you'll find a purple sheet with a postcard attached to it. And that concerns writing a message related to the 11th anniversary of the beginning of the war with Afghanistan. If you would, there's some sample messages, but you can create your own. And when you have done so and completed it, this basket will be up here, and you can just drop your card into the basket. The second action relates to the sheet that's entitled Minnesota Arms Spending Alternative Project. Basically, this calls at the bottom of the sheet, it calls messages to Obama, and in our case, we're going to write to Obama, Senators Klobuchar and Senator Franken. And the message at the bottom is that we're calling for shifting federal funding priorities from war excuse me, I lost my place here, from war and the interests of the few to meeting the essential needs of all. That's the basic intent of the message, and the rest is all the reasons why that's desirable. So I would invite you to at least scan these other messages, but you'll find a table over here entitled Advocacy with sheets of paper so that you can sign on. As this group, the top of the message speaks of us as this group meeting today wanting to support this resolution. Am I clear? Do you need help on this? Thank you. So now to introduce our, is this on? Can you hear me? Good, thank you. My personal connection with Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer goes back to at least the early 90s. With others locally, I participated in a process which led to the U.S. Kairos document entitled On the Way from Kairos to Jubilee, published in 1994. Jack was a member of the project steering committee, whose 22 members you would recognize as people of faith, distinguished by their passion for a just society. While I don't remember the time precisely, my personal connection with Jack actually goes back earlier, for this is the 3rd time I'm hearing him as the keynote speaker for a Christi assembly. I discovered yesterday that I had a sheet with very careful notes on its 2 sides of the talk given in 1991, anticipating the quincentenary. Using the Gospel of Mark in his analysis, Jack identified Rome's invulnerability, substitute United States, as one of 6 myths of Jesus' time. And he named as one of the Gospel's 4 challenges that it requires us to absolute conflict between authentic faith and empire. These insights and much else in my notes seem very contemporary to me. While I no longer have a complete file of the brochures on the annual assembly, I believe the third keynote address occurred before 1991. As you know from the bio in the assembly brochure, which is also in your packet, Jack has written 13 books. The latest, Authentic Hope, It's the End of the World as We Know It, but Soft Landings Are Possible, is available today. While I can't claim to have read all 13 books, I have owned and read several. Because of my own involvement in the effort to close the School of the Americas, with a new name but old shame, as some of its protesters say, I have read the School of Assassins several times on the bus traveling to Fort Benning, Georgia, for the November vigil to close its doors. Well, what I think is really distinctive about Jack's writing is that, as I once heard him say, when he feels strongly about an issue, he is prompted, perhaps compelled, to write. I believe he's also prompted to speak. We are fortunate to have him with us today to speak hopefully about our current crises and challenges. Help me to welcome Jack to address the topic, Foundations of Peace, Peace Conversion, and a Pathway to Equitable and Ecologically Responsible Economics.
May we ask you to turn off your cell phones, please?
Well, what a great pleasure for me, and I was unaware. I had forgotten that this would be a third time. Apparently you're slow learners, or maybe we just grow in together with the important things that we need to talk about. I think that's more likely the case. I have lots of songs that swim around in my head, and ironically on the way here I had the radio on, and I was shifting back from public radio, and then I would try to find some music, and the song that came on the radio was the REM song, It's the End of the World as We Know It.
Wow.
And so I listened to that song as it's running around in my head, and I'm wondering, I'm guessing that many of you know the punchline. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine, right? And this morning, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to feel fine, and then this afternoon I hope you'll be feeling finer. But honesty is essential to hope, and so we have to look carefully at the problems we face. Another song that's ringing around in my head is thanks to my daughter Hannah, who is living in San Francisco doing great work, and she's gotten into a musician, Randy Carlisle, and I don't know if any of you know who Randy Carlisle is, but she has a song, and is this being recorded or no? I know that
Yes.
there was a rumor of that. If it isn't, I'm more likely to, oh it is, okay. Then I'm less likely to sing it. I'll probably just, okay, well, I can try to sing the first verse. And it goes, all of these lines across my face tell you a story of who I am. So many stories of where I've been and how I got to where I am. But these stories don't mean anything if you've got no one to share them to. It's true, I was made for you. Okay, well that's, Randy Carlisle does a much better job. But it would be really interesting, I know that some of you have done this, but the power of story, and all of us have stories to tell about why we're even here today, what got us to this room. And I want to share with you just two old stories in my own life journey that help explain why I'm here and then what I'm about to share with you. And both of these stories actually occurred 40 years ago when, as an undergraduate student, I traveled and studied in India, Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, Taiwan, Japan, a number of other places. And this particular story is India and the United States were feuding because the United States was backing a repressive dictator in Pakistan. So a lot of things stayed the same. And because our countries were feuding, the Indian government said, your student group from St. Olaf College can't spend a month here. But they did give us permission to land in what was then called Bombay and spend a night there, and then we ended up going to Sri Lanka, which wasn't on our agenda, but we ended up spending a month there because we couldn't spend the month that was scheduled in India. So some of you have heard me tell this story before, but I want to tell it again. It's so important to who I am. And the story is we got to Bombay, it was pretty late at night, got on an old rickety bus, and we started moving in towards downtown. And I'm a young college student. I have lost, I think, 35 pounds in 30 days in Ethiopia. I was sick the entire time I'm there. So I'm weak, I'm probably emotionally vulnerable, and I'm seeing hundreds, thousands, many thousands of people who are getting ready for bed. Only they don't have homes and they don't have beds. And between the roadway, they're just laying out a sheet of plastic or a piece of cardboard. Some are living in culverts. And this is just kind of overwhelming me. And we move in further towards the capital city, where we have a hotel arranged for us, apparently. And our bus is stopped by a religious procession. And as this religious procession passes, I'm sitting on the right front of the bus, and I look out, and between me and Merle, about that distance, there's a little girl just screaming at the top of her lungs, clinging to her dead mother, who is lying on the edge of the street. And we stay there for what felt like an eternity. It was probably a few minutes, and then finally the bus jolts forward. We go in a little bit further into the capital city, and we come to a luxury hotel. A luxury hotel surrounded by people, again, sleeping in the street, by rats, by roaches, by unbelievable poverty. We're ushered off the bus by armed guards into this hotel, and awaiting us is a feast. More silverware than I've ever seen, fine china. They have an orchestra playing for us. And then this feast comes out, and I feel sick. I don't want to eat. I don't want to be there. I decide I'm not going to stay there. I push myself past the armed guards back onto the street and spent most of the night walking the streets of Bombay. A really, really foolish thing to do. And yet I survived that. Found myself back with my group before we got on a bus to go back to the airport to fly now to Sri Lanka. And I remember thinking very, very clearly at the time that what I had just experienced was a rather perfect metaphor for our world. And that was that the world is like a luxury hotel where a few people live, surrounded by armed guards determined to protect those privileges and keep people out, keep undesirables out. And that was a hard, hard, hard lesson for a 20-year-old person who grew up in an isolated suburb of Coon Rapids, Minnesota, to take in. And yet, that, in a way, that message, that story, that sense that we live in a world in which, in my case, I had a nice place prepared for me inside that hotel as a result of the accident of my birth. And yet I realized I didn't want to accept my place, and I didn't want to accept that world, that the real challenge that lay before me in my life was to change that world, was to convert that world to being a more peaceful place. So when we think about peace conversion, the first thing I would ask you to do is think about those terms. Yes, we need peace and we need conversion, but peace conversion isn't just an economic matter. Peace conversion is really a profound depth and change of heart. Now, here's another little aspect of that story. That awareness, that awakening almost killed me. And the result of it was joy and hope got pushed deep, deep within a hidden aspect of my soul. And that's another, I think, lesson to learn, is that we are human beings. And as human beings, when we confront issues of climate change or poverty or hunger or militarism and war, we need to recognize that we are human beings, that we have feelings, that we are fragile, that others are fragile. We're not machines. We don't just routinely and ropely go through life trying to do good. It's much more complicated than that. And the people we're trying to change also live incredibly complicated lives that make it difficult for people to want to take in some of the difficult issues that we face. And we can either meet them where they are, or we can meet them from a perspective of moral superiority and cut ourselves off from the fact that we are all human beings, all struggling, all grasping, all wondering, all trying to find bases for community and hope. So here's my second story. And it also happens to be from India. Even though I got on a plane and left, it turns out I was able to get back to India on an individual visa. So I was traveling with 3 friends of mine in India, and I spent more transformative experiences like the one I described earlier in Calcutta, walking the streets of Calcutta amidst unbelievable poverty, encountering so many children, desperate children, and trying to figure out how to live responsibly, even in that context, for a few days. But anyway, my friends and I, we got on a bus, and we were headed up towards a smaller city, and it was kind of on the way. You could see the Himalayas pretty well from there. This was after spending time in Calcutta and Bombay and Delhi and a lot of places, again, that were deepening my sense of almost internalized despair. Well, the bus breaks down. And we're stuck on this little narrow road, overlooking a big valley, and we're there for about 6 hours. And finally, they fix the bus, and we arrive in this town. We don't know anybody. It's really late. The bus is surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of people offering help. Stay here, come with us. And it's just overwhelming. And then this Indian on the bus says, do you need a place to stay? And I said, yes. And he said, you can stay with my family. Well, so we get off the bus. He gets off the bus with us. We walk up this mountain a little ways. We get to his family home, which is actually a fairly nice family home. His parents take us in. It's quite cold. They bring us blankets. They find places for us to sleep. They feed us. In the morning, this guy gives us some tickets for a bus that will take us a little further up the mountain and stay at this kind of a resort thing that happens to be closed, but it's a friend of his that he knows. Puts us up there, and I'm restoring my soul looking out at the Himalayas for a day. And it turns out this guy had not been home for 3 years. First time he had seen his family in 3 years. Now, I tell you that story because the lesson that I kind of learned through that story is a lesson about absolutely undeserved, unsolicited hospitality of a depth that that was transformative for me in that it fed that sense of hope and joy and possibility that was being crushed by the weight of the world that I was experiencing. And I tell you this because I think, in a way, those two stories are the human story, and they're where we're at as we think about our world coming to an end. It's not the end of the world, but our world as we know it is coming to an end, and that can be a very, very scary prospect. And as we move forward, we need to move forward, in my view, through the lens and through the spirit of that kind of hospitality. We need to model it. We need to bottle it. We need to open it up and share it with the world. We need to remember it. We need to nurture it. We need to cultivate it. And from my vantage point as a person of faith, we need to remember that that unsolicited hospitality shown to me that day is probably the best reflection we get of the character of God. It's the unsolicited welcoming, arms, rescue, presence, joy, that we need, I think, to deeply internalize. And I'm going to say this probably many times, and you'll say, why did you say it so much? You're repeating yourself, Jack. But our problems as we think about moving towards peace are the issue that we face as we try to convert the economy and convert the country from militarization and war to a peaceful economy and a peaceful place is not just a matter of better policies. The argument I make in this book is that we can get there, but the only pathway to getting to better policies is through a pathway of better values, is through a pathway of modeling in our daily lives and the choices we make and how we live, that hospitality and that sense of hope and possibility that we so long for. So I will, especially this afternoon, I will lay out some policy frameworks of things that we need to do, but I really want to emphasize that we're not in this culture, in this place, where militarization is a belief system, where violence is a belief system. Our challenges are much deeper than simply policy changes. Let me read one of my favorite quotes from Howard Zinn that kind of captures a little bit of this for me. He writes, "To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is not only a history of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifices, courage, and kindness. What we choose to emphasize in this complex history will determine our lives. If we see only the worst, it destroys our capacity to do something. If we remember those times and places, and there are so many, where people have behaved magnificently, this gives us the energy to act and at least the possibility of sending this spinning top of the world in a different direction. And if we do act, in however small ways, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory." Wow. To live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory. Well, so one other little personal story. Here's how I start my day out every day. At least I try. I sometimes forget. I try to remember something I learned from Thich Nhat Hanh, a peacemaker that probably many of you are familiar with. And he, I think, revolutionized Buddhism and really challenged it to be more than simply about individual and personal enlightenment, and that it had this social dimension. But he teaches mindfulness. I think Jesus taught mindfulness too. And the idea of mindfulness is really two things about mindfulness. One is, mindfulness is being fully present to the moment, and especially fully present to the miracle of each moment, to the joy and potential of joy in every moment. So sometime today, I hope you don't spend too much time looking outside and thinking, wow, what a wonderful day. I hope you're listening. But if you don't look at the leaves and you don't get filled by wonder, then we're not being mindful. So I start my day, I try to have the first thought, or one of my first thoughts every day when I wake up, wow, this is fantastic. I got another day. And it's another day to just be just grabbing on to this miracle that we're here and that we have this opportunity to live authentic lives and an opportunity to share meals, to share thoughts, to share struggles. It's just this attitude of that I think we sometimes forget. This is a miracle. We're here, and there's joy in that. But the second aspect of mindfulness that I carry with me from Thich Nhat Hanh is he says when we're truly mindful, it really leads us to bring our compassion into the struggle to transform the world, to end suffering, to be instruments and to be signs of and to be present, the presence of love and compassion and empathy into the public realm as well as into our personal realm. Now, because it's Pax Christi, I do want to say something about Jesus. I think that's okay, right?
Yeah, that's all right.
And I think that this is really, this particular challenge that we're in, and I'll say more about this in a few minutes, but we live as Christians in a really, really funny place, right? We live in a country where 84% of U.S. adults identify themselves as Christians. Jesus teaches love of enemies. Jesus calls us to be peacemakers. Jesus embodies peace. And we live literally in the most militarized country in human history. What a contradiction. And what I want to point out just briefly in my references to Jesus is that one of the things, and we share many things with Jesus, but one of the things we share with Jesus is that he too lived in the most militarized country in world history. That was his social context. That was where he discerned what the will of God was. That is where he came to his insights about the nature of a compassionate God. In the midst of an empire, in the midst of a militarized empire. And what's striking to me, and I tried to write some about this, about Jesus and the world that he lived in, is that Rome ruled in many ways very similar to the way the United States rules. Rome ruled in these ways. One, it ruled through ideology. And the ideology said that it was Rome's military might that was the key to world peace. It was Rome's capacity for violence that kept the world secure. Boy, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? A second kind of parallel, and this was in Jesus' world, is the way Rome ruled is it appointed client kings in the territories of the world that it sought to control to rule on its behalf. It sought, whenever possible, not to send Romans to rule directly. That was a no-no, although it was acceptable in extreme circumstances. But the way Rome, put it this way, who was the first ruler of Iraq for the United States? It was Paul Bremer, right? That's the equivalent to Pilate. Things got out of hand, and so you had to have direct Roman rule in that case, but that isn't the preferred strategy. Herod was the preferred strategy. A half-Jew who you put in power to rule on your behalf. So both Rome and the United States attempt to rule the world through client kings, through puppet governments, through governments that we control. The third pillar of power in Rome, and I would say that this would be remarkably challenging for us, is that Rome ruled through the religiously powerful. The temple was the principal economic and social and religious institution in first century Palestine. If you wanted to be high priest, you were appointed by Rome. And if you wanted to enter the holiest place in the temple once a year, on the Day of Atonement, you had to wear the right garb and robe. You had the right robe. And Rome kept that robe and would only give it to you if your temple rule was on behalf of Rome. So this is a very tough spot to be in, where you have to please Rome if you want to be a high priest, or if you want to be the high priest. It's a very vulnerable position. And I would say, overall, the way that religion functions in our country is as an echo chamber for patriotism, an echo chamber for nationalism, and in this particular moment, how shameful, I'm sorry, but how shameful that that some in the Catholic Church have defined marriage, abortion, denying women priests as the principal agenda item for the church at a time when we desperately need leadership on other things. Those are signs of the penetration of an imperial mindset into our religious culture and institutions. And that was central to the way that Rome ruled. And then finally, the final parallel with Rome is that Rome also ruled through its legions, through its soldiers, that if necessary, it would crush violently through military intervention any opposition. And some of you are familiar with this story, but many Christians are not. That right around the time that Jesus was born in first century Palestine, Herod the Great, the client king ruler, died. And in the aftermath of that death, there were uprisings all throughout Palestine. And some of the people claimed that the Messiah had come, that the Romans were about to be overthrown, and Rome came in and just crushed them and crucified thousands of people. Thousands of people were crucified, left in public streets for their bodies to rot and be eaten by wild animals as a sign that you don't mess with Rome. Think of death squads in El Salvador. Think of many other examples that we could give where this militarized empire, or the empire relies upon a militarized means to crush. Now what's also fascinating for me, and I want to get more back on topic here in a second, but all this is very connected for me because it's part of our context, is that I'm arguing that if we're going to have peace conversion, we're going to have to challenge the deep culture of war, the militarized culture that we live in. Now, I teach peace studies, and one of the kind of famous peace studies teachers is a guy named Johan Galtung from Norway, and he talks about, there's direct violence, that's when people kill each other, but that's not the most prominent violence. Then there's structural violence, where violence gets built into the very fabric of our society and causes hunger, poverty, and oppression. And all of us are implicated in that, he says. But he said the third violence is cultural violence. And cultural violence are all the ideas, all the ideologies, all the arguments, all the dog and pony shows that create support for and reinforce militarism and war. And it's that culture of violence that it seems to me we really need to challenge. And one of the things about a culture of violence, and one of the things about living in a militarized society, is that militarism and violence become, again, embedded in belief systems. I say that the two principal, the dominant values of American life today are these. American exceptionalism. We're unique. And because we're unique, we have privileges and responsibilities that nobody else has. Thereby, we can do what nobody else in the world is allowed to do. We can torture with impunity and redefine torture and say we don't care about the Geneva Conventions. We don't care about United Nations. We'll get some people to write some memos, and they'll say that waterboarding isn't torture and that these are enhanced interrogation techniques. We can have thousands and thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. Iran maybe can't be developing one, right? This was very striking to me when the United States was forced out of Iraq, by the way, forced out of Iraq. We wanted to stay for a very, very long time. The United States was forced out of Iraq. Hillary Clinton was in the region and was quoted in the paper as saying, yeah, we're going to move our soldiers out of Iraq, but we're going to be engaged with Kuwait and Bahrain and Yemen and all these other places. because we don't want any outside interference in the region. I mean, only in America could you hear that and not pay attention to a contradiction rooted in American exceptionalism. I mean, we could give thousands and thousands of examples. So American exceptionalism, that's dominant value number one. And dominant value number two is a belief that violence works. It's a belief that military solutions exist, that military power is an effective means of exercising influence. You got a problem, there's probably a military solution. And when you spend half the world's global or military spending, and when you devote 59 cents out of every dollar that Congress votes in their discretionary budget to war, every problem you have looks like it has a military solution. And at the table are people arguing in favor of, if we just do this, if we just do that, if we just build this weapon system. And then you get, of course, what we have is a military-industrial complex that is out of control. But this belief system, now back to Jesus, the belief system that I'm talking about in terms of militarism and violence, it doesn't just impact the dominant society, members of the dominant society. It impacts pretty much the whole world. And so, even revolutionaries who are very mindful of oppression and want to change it, they share this belief system in some way, right? And that results in a never-ending spiral of violence. Well, back to Jesus. So in Jesus' time, where did people root their hope? They rooted their hope in two places. One hope, and this comes from the tradition, was in the liberating violence of God joining forces with human beings that would help the Jews overthrow the Romans. They were waiting for a military Messiah, and a military Messiah, with the help of God's power, was going to cleanse the temple, oust the Romans, and boy, things were going to be great. It's going to be this great reversal in history. Well, I told you the story of how that worked out. It didn't work out very well. There was a rebellion. Rome sent in all these soldiers, thousands of people crucified. Second largest city burned to the ground, etc. But that was a place where people rooted their hope. The other place they rooted hope is they rooted hope in the apocalyptic worldview that said, don't put your hope in history, put your hope in the imminent end of the world. And the good news is that God is coming soon. God's winning a cosmic battle against the forces of evil. God is going to win that battle soon, and when God wins that battle, God is going to come back, wipe out our enemies, and all of us who, all the people we know who have died, who have been faithful, they will rise to eternal life. All of our enemies throughout history will rise, and they'll go to hell, and this is going to be a great outcome. It's the vindicating violence of God. Now, the gospel writers, this is a whole different topic, but they buy into a lot of this worldview, and they interpret a lot of Jesus through the lens of these worldviews. But here's my argument. My argument is we have a stream in the Bible in which it's pretty clear that Jesus breaks with those, and he says to the people, those are fantasy freedoms. If you're going to put your hope in the violence of God helping your military Messiah win, that's a fantasy freedom. If you think hope is at the end time, you're missing the whole point of God's imminent presence in the midst and heart of life and all circumstances that we find ourselves in, including the fact in first century Palestine that they were living in the most militarized and powerful empire in history, and including the fact that we are living in the most militarized country now in human history. So Jesus says, don't buy into this spiral of violence, don't buy into these fantasy freedoms, that in fact where hope is rooted is in the new community. And this new community is precisely about peace conversion. And how do you do peace conversion in first century Palestine under Roman occupation? Well, you build a much broader community. You break down the barriers that have been separating Samaritans from other Jews, and you say, that's ridiculous. You won't talk to Samaritans because they intermarried during a time of captivity? And Jesus welcomes people into the community. You break down the boundaries that have kept people who were poor and basically, or sick, and basically defined as being that way because they had sinned, and all of a sudden now they're part of the community. You expand the community to the point that you love your enemies. Why? Jesus would say, we need to love our enemies because that's the nature of God, but Jesus, I think, would also say we need to love our enemies because they see aspects of ourselves that we can't see. We're not willing to see. We need to learn from our enemies. Oh, and God knows how much do we have to learn from our enemies today. If I read one more article and hear one more newscast about these uprisings in the Middle East related to this film, that implies that film was something other than a spark for something much, much deeper, I'm going to just break the TV, which I should have done 20 years ago, probably. My point being, Jesus says and invites them, people in his own time, and I think we need to invite people in our own time, to build the kind of community, extensive community, that breaks down so many barriers, that allows us, in fact, to embody the compassion of God in the midst of this, now I would say, declining empire. Some of you have, if you've read any of my other work, you know I cite a French historian, Emmanuel Todd. And Emmanuel Todd is famous in Europe for predicting the collapse of the Soviet Union. And he said, you know, when everybody else was looking at the Soviet Union's strength, he was looking at their economic weakness, at their social weakness, at their kind of internal unraveling that was masked by this incredible military power and sense of being in this superpower competition. Well, he made the same prediction for the United States in the context of the U.S. involvement in Iraq. So, we, it seems to me, have a lot that we can draw on with Jesus in thinking about parallels to that time. All right, so now I'm going to move on and actually start my talk. No. So here are just kind of, let me preface this and say, my wife always makes fun of me because I speak in fives or threes or fives or threes. Anyway, it's because I have so many things rattling around in my head all the time that if I don't try to get it down in a somewhat organized way, I'll go insane. So I hope this is helpful, but don't be surprised by talking threes and fives. Okay, so here's my first spot. 5 things that I want us thinking about as we think about the challenge of peace conversion. Point 1. We're living in the midst of a planetary emergency. Actually, as an overall species, we're sleepwalking through a planetary emergency. And yeah, we're faced with what I'm calling a planetary emergency. And I'm speaking specifically about climate at this point. That what the climate scientists are telling us, and I think what the droughts and floods and heat waves and fires and rising sea levels and all the things that we're hearing about are telling us, they're speaking to us. As clearly as they can speak, is that we are faced with a planetary emergency. The second point that I would make is that we are the most militarized country in the history of the world, and that militarization and war and embracing this belief system about the utility and usefulness of violence is literally killing the future. All right, so we have a planetary emergency. We're largely sleeping through it. We're living in the most militarized country in the history of the world, and militarization is killing the future. It endangers the future. The third point that I'll emphasize is that there are, at least I believe, there are solutions to the problems that we face. There just are not military solutions to the problem we face. And those non-military solutions become impossible if we don't recognize what I just said. In other words, if we don't recognize that there aren't military solutions to the problems we face, our prospects of finding solutions are pretty slim. The fourth point that I'd like to start with is that if I'm right about that there aren't military solutions, if I'm right that militarization is threatening the future, if I'm right that for a variety of reasons we're facing a planetary emergency, then it means citizens of the United States are culpable and responsible, and there's great challenges that we face. If we're citizens of the most militarized country in the history of the world at a time when militarization threatens to kill the future, that means we have particular responsibilities. And then what I said earlier, as we think about solutions, the solutions just aren't a matter of policy. They go at that much deeper cultural level. So what do we need? It seems to me, here's a few things that we need. Probably another group of 4 or 5. One is, we need an honest assessment of where we are. And I'm going to look in a minute at 5 converging issues that are all coming together to end the world as we know it. Not to end the world, but to end the world as we know it. So one is just a statement, we need to have the courage to look honestly. And I tried in my earlier story about my personal struggle in India, is to say that takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage to look honestly at where we're headed. And I think one of the reasons that we're so reluctant as a culture and as a society and as a people to face problems is because of that fact. It's a little scary when you take an honest look. All right, a second thing that we need, therefore, so that we don't bury the possibility of hope and joy deep within our souls, is we need to unlock our imaginations to be able to envision alternative pathways to, in this case, peace conversion, right? How can we get there? What can we unleash a sense of possibility and vision a different future? Now, what I'd suggest is, if we can't envision a different future, we won't work for it. If we just think it's absolutely impossible, and if that's the message that we're sending people, well, I think we're in trouble. So we need to unlock our imaginations, envision pathways to an alternative future. A third need is we need to see ourselves as actors capable of acting, capable of working towards the changes, capable of embodying some of the values that we're going to need in terms of changing course. You know, a simple way of saying this is we need to do what we need to do so that we don't feel simply just overwhelmed by the weight of the crises that we sense around us. We need to see ourselves as capable actors. A fourth point of our need is we need a way of seeing the world that gives us courage and hope. And I bring you back to that quote from Howard Zinn. Zinn says, if we just see the awful, and that's all we see, then what we'll do is we'll live in a bed of cynicism. And so our way of seeing needs to include the multiple miracles and signs of connection and compassion that most of us in this room experience every day. So we need to have, in the book I wrote about Jesus in first century Palestine, what really struck me, almost more than anything about Jesus, is that he took the most honest look imaginable of first century Palestine. He understood Roman imperialism. He understood what the temple was doing. He understood the domination system. He walked hand in hand with the destitute. And he did that, and while he did that, what guided him, what overwhelmingly guided him, was a sense of possibility. And what he saw all around him, in the midst of that, was either abundance or the potential for abundance. And he rooted that way of seeing, I believe, in his experience of what God was like. Jesus' God, for Jesus at least, was a God of abundance, a God of compassion, a God of invitational power, inviting us in every moment of every day to live authentic lives. So we need to cultivate a similar way of seeing. And then finally, in this sequence of 5, we need to remember that hope is not something that we come to based on our assessment of a ledger sheet. Okay, we don't draw a column up in the morning and we go, I just read the paper and there were 15 articles that impressed me. And there were 3 over here that were slightly hopeful. I guess that's enough for me to get out of bed today. You know? Hope is a decision that we make. Hope is a decision we make to embody our deepest concerns, our deepest convictions, our deepest passions into daily life and action. But it's a decision. Hope is a decision. It's a decision that needs to be made manifest in our daily lives. It's not a ledger sheet. If we have a ledger sheet version of hope in this culture that I think is designed intentionally to get us to feel that we aren't significant, that we can't change things, that our voices don't matter, that can become a self-fulfilling and spiraling ball rolling down a hill that crushes the sense of hope and possibility. And one of the great things about recognizing that hope isn't a ledger sheet, but it's decisions we make about how we live every day, is that then we can appreciate the many signs of hope that exist in our own families, in our own communities, in our own nation, throughout the world. And it's never an easy piece. It's not, hope isn't, I think sometimes the Enlightenment encouraged this idea, we're moving in, directly in a kind of constant line towards a better society. Well, read Howard Zinn. I introduce my students to Howard Zinn. Howard Zinn just shows over and over out through history. You go this way, and then you make a little progress, and then there's pushback, and then you go down a little bit more, and then you surge a little bit, and then that's just the way the nature of life is. And in the midst of that, hope is a constant, in the sense that hope is a decision that people make to live out their authentic values every day. So hope is not a ledger sheet. So here's just another little sequence here, a few central concepts in my way of thinking about our challenge for peace conversion and ecological sensibility and sustainability. One concept that I talk in this book about is dead-end roads. A dead-end road is very simple to talk about. If you don't change direction, you're likely to get where you're headed, right? And if you look at where we're headed, it's not a very pretty picture, ecologically or in other ways. So, I'll talk about these 5 converging issues in a minute, but just this concept of dead-end road just says, and what I want to say to you is, just because you're on a dead-end road doesn't mean you have to stay on it, right? Was it Yogi Berra, the Yankee philosopher catcher, who said, when you come to a fork in the road, take it. So we don't have to stay on the dead-end road. A second concept, the second central concept is, I call it painful positives. Painful positives. How many of you have ever been confronted by something that was really difficult to hear, but in retrospect you went, boy, I really needed to hear that. That was really helpful for me. I remember, this just flashed into my mind right now, but I remember being in, it was probably 8th grade, maybe 9th grade. And I was in that tough teenage position of trying to figure out what was cool, where I fit in. And I was a really good athlete, and I had a community there, and I was engaged in my church, and I had a community there. But then there were these cool kids, and they smoked and they drank and they did all this stuff, and that was kind of cool to think about and where I was going to fit in it. And I remember a teacher came up to me one day and he said, Jack, here's what I want us to think about. One of the most important decisions you ever make is who you choose to hang around with. Well, he said, he left. And that was kind of a painful positive, because it actually was really, really helpful in that I did think consciously about kind of what pathways I wanted to try. Here's another one. If any of you are alcoholic or have lived in an alcoholic family, you know all the damaging ripples of alcoholism, how destructive that can be. You also know how difficult it is to have an intervention of any kind. And yet I would say that's a painful positive, right? If you have an intervention, because what it opens up is a painful positive, opens up the possibility of a different future, the possibility of moving in a different direction. So think about when we come to terms with some of what the climate scientists are telling us, for example. Boy, that's a painful thing. But it opens up space for us to possibly move away from coal, to move away from oil, to move away from fracking, to really embrace a pathway. Yes, it's going to be hard to get there, but the outcomes are potentially much better. That's a painful positive. Another concept is soft landings. Again, it's the end of the world as we know it. It's not the end of the world. And the question is, can we envision and can we move ourselves, our nation, our country, our communities in a direction that is truly, truly sustainable? And so a soft landing is possible. Now I got to be honest here. When I write in the book about climate change, I change my language. And what I say when I address climate change is, it's the end of the world, and soft landings may be possible. We don't know. We don't know where those crossing points are, and that's kind of scary. But we still know, even in that framework, we still know what we should be doing. We don't control necessarily whether we've already reached a point that's going to be so damaging, but in any case, the avenues and the importance of acting are still clear. And then the last kind of central concept to mention is what I call authentic hope. You know, most of us grew up, I think, with a lot of inauthentic hope. And inauthentic hope, for me, is most clearly demonstrated in optimism disconnected from reality. You know, don't worry. I mean, the latest kind of thing is, don't worry about these problems because technology is going to fix this, right? We got great minds. We don't have to worry about resource shortages. Technology will do this. Well, that's inauthentic hope. You know, for me, an equivalent would be if your plans for retirement are winning the lottery. That's probably inauthentic hope. And I think we have a lot of that. I think politicians get elected because they offer us all kinds of reasons for inauthentic hope, and that's part of our responsibilities to change that. So here's a couple of questions for you to think about, and it would be interesting to see how you would answer these. Do you believe it's possible to improve the quality of life for present and future generations while dramatically lessening our ecological footprints? I do. Do you believe it's possible to improve quality of life for present and future generations while dramatically lessening our ecological footprints? That, in a nutshell, that's our challenge. And if we don't believe that's possible, then I can pretty much guarantee that when we're out there trying to mobilize people and encourage them to live differently and respond to all the things that we care about, the ultimate message we're going to send them is they don't really believe it's possible. So why should I listen to them, right? So it's a very important question how we answer this. Second, do you believe it's possible to build a peace culture and a peace economy that makes war as unacceptable as slavery?
Yes.
Do you believe it's possible to build a peace culture and peace economy that makes war as unacceptable as slavery?
Mm-hmm.
Well, as unacceptable as slavery. Yeah. I just spent a really interesting weekend as a free consultant to a group out in Portland, Oregon, led by Rotarians who have started a project to end war. Wow, that was hopeful in itself. You know, I said, if Richard Nixon can go to China, the Rotarians can end war. And it was amazing. And you know, they didn't quite take me up on my challenge, but I think I planted a seed where they're looking for, you know, a means and how do we move forward. And my suggestion to them was, I said, well, you're in 200 countries or more. I said, set a couple goals. And one of the goals is that you are going to work in each of the countries where there are Rotarians to reduce military spending by 50% by 2020. That'd be cool. Get the Rotarians to do that. Anyway, they're percolating, and it was just really cool for me. So I believe the answer to that question is yes. It's a hard place to get to, but I believe yes. I would still say yes. A third, really important question that I'm sure you're already asking, that we'll probably come to this afternoon is, well, what obstacles do we face? You know, what's getting in our way? If we believe this is possible and desirable, what gets in the way? And the fourth question that we should be asking ourselves is, what do we need to overcome those obstacles? What do we need to overcome those obstacles? And then the final question that I would pose is, what values need to guide our vision and our actions? What values need to guide our vision and our actions? And I've got a few ideas about that as well. All right, well, let me spend a few minutes now on the five core issues that I see converging. And all these impact the topic that you assigned me today to think about the importance of peace conversion and its connection to ecology. So here's 5 problems that all intersect and create the overall conditions that I'm claiming mean that it's the end of the world as we know it. And I would say it's the end of the world as we know it, and in some ways there's nothing we can do to prevent the end of the world as we know it from happening. But there's a lot we can do to frame the world that's coming and to shape and hopefully solve many of the problems. In other words, within each of these 5 problems that are converging to end the world as we know it, they don't preclude the possibility of soft landings, and our honest assessment of them open up the possibility of soft landings. Okay? So here's number 1. Ecology disconnected from economics, or economics disconnected from ecology, better said. Boy, we're seeing a lot of evidence of this, and it's not. I'll say something about climate change in a minute. That's a separate category for me. This is deeper than climate change. This is the fact that we live on a finite planet with limited resources that we can maximize through our ingenuity and science and technology and wisdom and all those things. But if we don't recognize that economics needs to be in harmony with ecology, and where this comes up over and over again, the problem is almost any politician you will ever listen to, I don't care if they're Republican or Democrat, what they are looking for and they're arguing about is how do we grow the economy, right? And the solution to our problem is to grow the economy. Well, I was pleased to see during the writing of this book that in Great Britain, the British government appointed a scientific or a commission, many economists were on it, and they were to probe the simple question, are the growth assumptions that we have in our economic system at all realistic into the future? And lo and behold, they came back with a simple answer. No. They're not at all realistic. And then they visited those earlier studies about the limits of growth, and they talk about some of the strengths and weaknesses of those arguments. But basically they said that the big challenge that faced them was prosperity without growth. The big challenge, they said, facing economics is that economics is disconnected from ecology, and that the real challenge for Great Britain and others was how do you improve quality of life outside of a growth model. So that's hopeful, in that even you have at that level, it's not just Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer talking about that our economic system is disconnected from ecology. It's not just Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer or a few others who are saying, wait a minute, even the progressive economists, like Paul Krugman and Robert Reich and all these others, are really devoting much of their intellectual energy into arguing about how you grow the economy, because growth is the solution in their measure. So this presents us with enormous challenges. Okay, the second converging issue is climate change. And I won't say a lot about this. I'm presuming that many of you are concerned about climate change. I would just encourage you, when I talked about the planetary emergency, that is a language now that some climate scientists are appropriating, are using. So saying we face a planetary emergency, and we need to have a response to climate change that is far-reaching, deep, well-funded, etc. And again, they would say we're sleepwalking through this emergency. Just to give you one example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in their last report a couple of years ago, they called for a 25 to 40% reduction, 25 to 40% reduction in carbon emissions by 2020. That's just 7 years away. The U.S., when the U.S. attended the most recent international climate gathering, the president offered a 4% reduction from 1990 levels, and even that was not at all realistic given the Koch brothers and the pressure on Congress to do nothing. So it gives you a sense here. So climate change is the second one, that whether we want to stay on the same path or not, we don't really have a choice about that. We're not going to be on the same path. That path that we've been on isn't available to us. And trying to stay on it just magnifies the crisis. All right, the third thing that's converging is economics disconnected from equity. Economics disconnected from an equitable distribution of the benefits of the economy. And I'm talking about local economies and national economies and international economies. You've probably heard some of these statistics before. I'll just give you a couple. Last year, 93% of the income gains in the country went to the richest 1% in the United States. So all the national income gains of last year, 93% of the benefit of that went to the richest 1%. Now this is a part of a 30-year pattern where the richest few are garnering very, very little of the, they're getting almost all of the economic benefit. And worldwide, you probably heard this statistic, the 3 richest people in the world have assets greater than the combined gross domestic products of the 48 poorest countries. So it just gives you an idea of. Now here's the good news again, and I talk actually quite a bit about good news in my book, is that there's a wonderful book that some of you may have heard of called The Spirit Level. Interesting title for this book, but it looks at the importance of equity. And it looks at studies from all over the world, mainly Western Europe and the United States and the developed countries, and looking at the relationship between inequality and social problems and equity and social health. And what these studies show is really quite remarkable. Just a couple of the conclusions. One conclusion is that every major social indicator is hurt by inequality. And the closest correlative factor behind a social problem is how unequal a society is. So inequality is linked with everything from lower life expectancy, higher infant mortality, higher violent crime rates, higher prison population, greater obesity, less trust, poorer health outcomes. I mean, every problem that you can name in the society is linked directly to the degree of inequality in a country, which helps explain, while the myth of American exceptionalism says we're number one, we in fact are number one in military spending, we're number one in foreign arms sales, we're number one in some other categories that we don't want to be number one in, but the United States ranks horribly at the bottom in almost every significant measure of social well-being of all the industrial countries. Let me give you one example. We're the only country in the developed world that doesn't treat healthcare as a moral right. That has a morality that tolerates people being sick, not getting treated, dying because they're not being treated. Or one of the figures that really stood out for me is that there are 800,000 home foreclosures in the United States linked to a health emergency every year. 800,000 home foreclosures each year linked to a health crisis because of our healthcare system. The similar number in Japan, 0. Germany, 0. Britain, 0. France, 0. Japan, 0. South Korea, 0. Taiwan, 0. Scandinavia, 0. So inequality has many and bad social outcomes linked, are closely linked. But here was another one that really stood out in that study. The richest people in the United States live less long, shorter lives than the poorest person in Norway. The poorest people in Norway live longer and healthier than the richest people in the United States. Most of us think inequality is bad for the poor, and we would be right. But what these studies show is that inequality is bad for the rich and the poor, because it breaks down the fabric of society, it breaks down social trust, it breaks down all kinds of things. Now here's another piece of good news. Another piece of good news is that in a recent poll, they gave people, and I can tell you more about the study if you want, but I'm just going to cite one aspect of it. They asked people to choose. Do you want to live in country A or would you want to live in country A with this wealth distribution, or country B with this wealth distribution? Country A was roughly the United States. And in the United States, by the way, the bottom 40% get 0.4% of the wealth. So 40% of Americans are living on 0.4% of the wealth. Okay, so that was country A, and it broke this down into quintiles, where the wealth was going. And then country B was roughly Sweden. Well, here was the outcome. I think it was 92 or 93% of the people polled said they wanted to live in Sweden. Republicans, over 90%. Democrats, it was about 94%. It didn't matter, women, men, black, white, rich, poor, didn't matter. They all said, I prefer to live in a distribution of Sweden. So that, I think, is actually good news, because the fact that Americans don't understand the nature of the society that they live in is bad news. But the fact that at least there is this impulse is good news. Now here's the other piece of good news. And I spent a lot of time on this because I felt like I was being kind of negative before. Another piece of good news is that one of the things that they conclude through all these studies done in this book, The Spirit Level, is they conclude that it would be possible to dramatically reduce the U.S. gross domestic product and our ecological footprint and improve the quality of life. So the way I talk about this is that our challenge, and I think this is absolutely possible, our challenge is we have to have a different definition of what the purpose of the economy is. And the purpose of the economy, Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer says, the purpose of an economy is to provide a sufficient material foundation for a meaning-based society.
Yeah.
The purpose of an economy is to create a sufficient material foundation for a meaning-based society. And what, again, these studies show is that once you have your essential needs met, there's almost no relationship between increased wealth and happiness, increased wealth and well-being. And so if we're accepting the challenge that we need to move to an ecologically sustainable economy, there's a lot of good news out there that we can do that. And I would just ask you to think about it. What gives your life meaning? What fills you with joy? You know, and I would answer that, well, of course, it's a full stomach in a place to live and decent health care. That's that meaningful foundation, right? But then it's family, it's friends, it's a simple meal, it's a garden, it's music, it's art, it's biking, it's, you know, a whole series of things that we can name, none of which are particularly materially intensive. That's part of that visioning that I'm inviting us to take up. Okay, I could say a lot more about that, but I'm not going to. So the fourth converging issue is the high cost of militarization at war. And again, this is one that is absolutely ripe for me, from my view, with opportunity. Dwight Eisenhower, many of you are familiar, you know, he gave his last speech to the country and he warned about what? Military-industrial complex. And here's what he was warning us of. And you just read between the lines a little bit. He had 3 or 4 concerns. One of the concerns was, he said, our democracy is in trouble. Our democracy is threatened by the undue influence of the military-industrial complex. Well, I wonder if it was true then. It's true today that the top 10, keep this in mind when Republicans say they care about the budget. The top 10 recipients of federal dollars in the United States are all defense contractors. The top 10 recipients of federal money in the budget are all defense contractors. So he was telling us our democracy was being threatened. But what Eisenhower was also saying is that because of the power of the military-industrial complex, military spending levels were now disconnected from defense, disconnected from authentic security needs. They were functioning independently based on the profit interests and power interests of this network, right, the military-industrial complex. And by extension, I think Eisenhower was also warning that the wars we would be fighting are disconnected from the authentic security needs of the nation and now would be driven by the same profit interests and power interests of these groups. Now, on the depressing side, there's a very, very telling story I have in my book that actually comes from a book by Bob Woodward called Obama's War. And the scene is this. Obama has asked his military advisors for ideas and plans and options about what to do in Afghanistan. This is before he chose to escalate, right? And he's looking at what they've given him, and he says, I asked you for options, and you've given me one. Escalate, escalate, or escalate. And Obama apparently seems to be a little flustered by this, according to Woodward. And then one of the generals says, well, Mr. President, you really don't have a choice here. You better follow your generals, because what would it look like if all of us resign en masse tomorrow? And Woodward says it was clear, the implication was absolutely clear that this president was not in a position to challenge this group. Well, that is just a powerful, chilling tale of a military-industrial complex that is out of control. Now, why do I say that on this one there's a lot of good news? Because I think it is increasingly clear to more numbers of people in this country, in spite of the fear, in spite of the culture of war, it's an opportunity that we have to challenge them. And the opportunities are there because people are recognizing that their class sizes are getting bigger, their libraries are closing, their hours are being cut, the roads aren't being fixed, bridges are falling down, all at a time when the military budget for wars has dramatically increased since the collapse of our real and only adversary, the Soviet Union. I would say that we've now reached a point, and I think that this is the case that we ultimately need to make, that the military-industrial complex is now morphed into the greatest threat to the security of the nation.
That's right.
And is undermining the fabric of the nation at every turn. And this afternoon I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the logic and strategy and tactics we're using in the Minnesota Arms Spending Alternatives Project. I'm going to try to recruit some of you to help in that effort, because I think one of the strengths of that effort is it allows us to go into communities and have a conversation with people who are concerned about certain things but aren't making any connection between what's happening in their communities and the high cost of militarization and war. And if we pass up an opportunity to build those relationships, we're missing something very, very important. Okay, two more things, and then I want to open it up for a few minutes for your questions. And then again, this afternoon, I'm going to talk more about some initiatives that I think can really help us take advantage of the situation, move in the direction of peace conversion, and respond to these 5 converging forces. But here's the 5th one. The 5th converging force, where we're reaching the end of the rope, or a recognition of dead-end roads, is money-driven politics. And what has happened to our political system as a result of defining corporations as people, of allowing unlimited contributions from corporations in recent Supreme Court rulings. But really, the problem predates that by a lot. We have seen the I would say, a fundamental transformation of politics in this country over the last 30 years that has, unfortunately, dramatically impacted both political parties. Now, I gotta say, that doesn't mean that elections are unimportant, that everybody is the same. It does mean, and I'm going to be really brutally honest here, it does mean that I think we're living at a time where one of the political parties has been taken over by an extremist ideology.